On November the 6th, 2018, at the age of 81, died former Premier or Provincial Prime Minister of Quebec and former leader of the pro-independence party, Parti Québécois, Bernard Landry. He had been born in March 1937 and was therefore 81 years old. He also worked as a lawyer, a teacher, and researcher. He was born in Saint-Jacques, Quebec, near Joliette, the son of Thérèse Granger and Bernard Landry. His first wife, Lorraine Laporte, died in 1999. They had 3 children together. And in June 2004, he married scriptwriter and former Yéyé singer Chantal Renaud. His mother tongue was obviously French, like that of most Quebecers. He also spoke fluent English and Spanish. He received a law degree from the University of Montréal, or from the Université de Montréal, and a degree in economics and finance from Institut d'études politiques de Paris. From September 2005, he was a professor at the Université du Québec à Montréal in the Business Strategy Department. In February 2008, he hosted the final round of the finance quiz at the 2008 Financial Open at that university. He died of complications or from complications of pulmonary or lung fibrosis. The first chairperson of the Parti Québécois, René Lévesque, attracted him to politics ironically already in 1964 or around 1964 when he was serving in the provincial Quebec government of Liberal Premier Jean Lesage. In 1968, Bernard Landry joined the Parti Québécois. He unsuccessfully sought a seat in the Quebec National Assembly or provincial legislature in 1970, but was elected there in 1976. He then became the Minister of State of Economic Development in February 1977, serving in this position until March 1981. In 1980, he obviously campaigned in the first referendum to give the Quebec provincial government a mandate to negotiate the terms of separation from the rest of Canada with the Canadian federal government, but as we know, almost 60% or over 59% of the participating voters rejected this referendum proposal. He again served as Minister of Economic Development until September 1982, when he was appointed Delegate Minister to Exterior Commerce. He later served as the Quebec Minister of International Relations and Exterior Commerce and Minister of Finance. During the 1988 Canadian federal election, actually in 1985, when Premier René Lévesque quite suddenly announced his decision to resign, Bernard Landry was one of the candidates to succeed him, but he lost to Pierre-Marc Johnson, who then served as the Quebec Premier for some months until the Parti Québécois' painful defeat to the Quebec Liberal Party under former Premier Robert Bourassa in the December 1985 Quebec provincial elections. But during the 1988 Canadian federal election, he supported the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States, as did Jacques Parizeau. Their support played a role in the Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney's dominance in Quebec during the election. The Progressive Conservatives managed to win a record 63 seats out of 75 in Quebec, although some 10 of their deputies, then led by Lucien Bouchard, resigned from the party and formed the Bloc Québécois parliamentary group and party after the June 1990 failure of the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord, whose purpose had been to make Quebec formally accept the 1982 Canadian federal constitution. The legislatures of 2 provinces out of 10, Manitoba and Newfoundland, refused to accept the accord on time without modifications. After the Parti Québécois had lost the 1985 Quebec provincial election to the Liberals, Mr. Landry had taught in the Department of Administrative Sciences at the Université du Québec à Montréal until 1994. That year, the Parti Québécois returned to power, defeating the provincial Liberals. Jacques Parizeau became the new premier or provincial prime minister, and he appointed Mr. Landry as his deputy premier, in which position he served from September 1994 to December 1998. In 1995, he, Parizeau, and many other members of the and supporters of the Parti Québécois campaigned hard in the weeks and months leading up to the second referendum to give the Quebec provincial government a mandate to negotiate the terms of independence and separation from the rest of Canada with the Canadian federal government. That time, over 49% of the participants who cast valid votes favored giving the Quebec provincial government that mandate, compared to over 40% in 1980. Premier Parizeau openly said during the press conference or during a speech to his supporters, on est battu, mais par quoi? Par l'argent et par les votes ethniques. C'est essentiellement ça. We have been beaten, but by what? By money, or by the money, meaning the generous support of the Canadian federal government that was then led by the Liberal Prime Minister Jean Charest, and by the ethnic votes. The controversy that ensued after the speech was so great that Parizeau quickly announced his decision to resign, and in January 1996, Lucien Bouchard succeeded him as the Quebec provincial prime minister. Not only Parizeau, but also Landry was accused of having spoken disparagingly of immigrants on the night of the 1995 referendum. The Gazette, an English language newspaper in Montreal, reported that 2 employees at the Intercontinental Hotel in the city planned to file a complaint against Mr. Landry with the Quebec Human Rights Commission. Anita Martinez, a night clerk at the hotel, said that Mr. Landry had told her, "It was because of you immigrants that the no won," and added, "Why is it that we open the doors to this country so you can vote no to Quebec sovereignty?" Of course, those remarks were judged as being racist, or at the very least ethnocentric. Because, as Premier Parizeau pointed out in his speech, only by some tens of thousands of votes the yes side had won. And it would take the Quebec Francophones only a couple of percent more of the support for independence in the next referendum for it to succeed. Landry became the Quebec premier or provincial prime minister in March 2001 after Lucien Bouchard had resigned. In office, he was a Quebec sovereigntist advocating a supranational confederation of Quebec and Canada inspired by the European Union's institutions. As such, he was one of the most faithful followers of René Lévesque and the other sovereignty associationists. This position is the one according to which Quebec would become politically independent of the rest of Canada. However, it would retain economic ties with the rest of Canada. When I was still living in Canada before I returned to Finland in 1993, some Quebec sovereigntists, such as, if I remember correctly, Mr. Parisot, even argued that even if Quebec separated from the rest of Canada, the inhabitants of Quebec would or should be allowed to keep automatically their Canadian citizenships. In my opinion, that would have been inconsistent and even ridiculous. Why should they automatically be allowed to keep their citizenships of a country or the country from which they had voted or would have voted to separate from? I just don't know. In my opinion, they should have filed a separate application to keep their citizenships. In 2001, he criticized the Canadian federal government because it had given Quebec an extra $1.5 billion in equalization payments, calling it degrading Quebec's status and accusing the federal government of shortchanging the province for decades by stating, receiving equalization payments for over 40 years in a row, is clear evidence that the central government failed in redistributing real wealth. On the other hand, the equalization payments are given to those provinces which are poorer, or although he may have indirectly then criticized the federal government for implying that Quebec was an economically poor province. In 2001, during the Parti Québécois leadership race, he had criticized the Canadian federal government's policy of prominently displaying the maple leaf, which appears in the middle section of the Canadian flag, on federal government buildings and programs by saying, "Le Québec ne ferait pas le trottoir pour un bout de chiffon rouge," or Quebec does not prostitute itself for a piece of red cloth. His aggressive remarks were widely criticized for insulting the Canadian flag, particularly among English-language media, which rendered chiffon as rag. He then apologized, but still insisted that his words had been mistranslated, because the Quebec provincial flag has a white cross on a blue background, and then, if I remember correctly, it has in each of the 4 small squares, it has that fleur de lis emblem, which comes originally from France, emphasizing Quebec's continued cultural and linguistic and even economic and political links with France. In 2003, he clearly lost the Quebec provincial election to the Quebec Liberals led by Jean Charest. A renowned documentary named A Hauteur d'Homme, to the height of man, about his viewpoint of the election was produced in 2003. In August 2004, he announced that he would remain president or chairperson of the Parti Québécois and would lead it to the next election in order to help Quebec become independent. However, in June 2005, despite having gained an approval of over 76% of the participating delegates at the party conference, he announced that he would resign after his successor was chosen.